or look tired, that's probably why. So there you go. Thanks so much for having me today. Really excited to be here, be a part of this, and share some thoughts and ideas. I will probably just give you a couple seconds about myself, just so that you know sort of who I am and where I'm coming from, and then we'll dig into some stuff here today. I'm not in youth ministry actually anymore, but just sort of finished my tenure about 15 or 16 years in youth ministry about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so we fully transitioned into church helper at that point. My wife, Lauren, and I are the founders of that. And it started last year. In around October, after we came off a 3-year contract working with a group of churches on next generation engagement. And one of the big things that I learned in working with a large group of churches, there was about 28 churches that we were contracted to work with, was that I'd go in and a lot of people would say, we'd really like, you to bring some young people into our church. And these were mostly churches that were aging or hadn't seen vibrant youth or kids ministries for a long time. And we would get to talking and we would realize that even if I had the magic power to drop 20 teenagers into their church that day, they probably wouldn't have had a good experience. The church probably wouldn't have had a good experience, and it would have overall been a little bit rough. And it was those foundational pieces underneath in those churches that were kind of missing. And the more and more we started having those conversations about less even about youth ministry and more about mission and desire and what those churches were going for, we started to dig into some really interesting things. And when that contract ended about a year ago, we decided that we would continue doing that on our own, and we've been able to move that into something that we're able to do a little bit more regularly. So we're really excited about that. My wife, Lauren, was also in ministry, in a church ministry, serving before we started this. So we've got some different experiences, a couple of different denominations that we've worked for. So we've tried to, take that knowledge and experience and just kind of say, okay, what questions can we ask and what can we do and that sort of thing. I'm from New Dundee. Well, I'm not from New Dundee. I'm from Niagara Falls. I live in New Dundee, which is a small town just about 5 minutes north of Kitchener. As Joey mentioned, I'm married. My wife, Lauren. We have a 2.5-year-old daughter and a 14-week-old, which is very exciting. And so that's a little bit about me and sort of where I'm coming from. Today, we're going to talk a little bit less about specific youth ministry strategies, but more holistically as to how the church is looking maybe at your youth ministry. Things that I've discovered through conversations along the way that have been barriers for the growth of youth ministry, that have been things that people have come up against that they don't even see or know are happening. And so that's kind of where I wanted to focus today. So I've got 4 things to talk about and a couple of stories to share. As Joey said, feel free to drop a question in the chat. If I always say during a presentation that I'm doing, if I've said something that you're not along with me or you don't get, just interrupt me and say, hey, can you re-go over that again? Because I'd rather everybody come along together than you sort of be playing catch up or not know sort of what's going on. So a few things that I've noticed when working with different churches through youth ministry and family ministry and other ministries as well that I think are relevant to us today. And here's the first one that I wanted to point out. And it's this idea that most churches right now are struggling to measure or define success. And what happens when that happens is that it always trickles down into youth ministry as well. And this is something that we don't always look at when we're in youth ministry because we're not always big picture looking. Sometimes we're looking at our own ministry instead of looking at the church as a whole. But if the church as a whole, the elders, the staff, or even the congregation don't know how to measure what's working and what's not working within the church, that's going to happen in your ministry as well. So a couple areas that I've seen this happen. There's one church that we were working with where they were hiring a new youth ministry person, and their last couple of hires hadn't really worked out. They hadn't gone as well as they would like. So they were working on trying to get somebody new, and we started a conversation with them. And so they had a job description ready, and they showed us the job description and said, hey, this is the job description that we're going to hire for. And I just said, hey, before you show me the job description, let's just talk about what youth ministry looks like when it's working. And so a handful of us in the room kind of just talked about what it was when it was working. And after about an hour, we had some notes, and we showed the notes, and then we showed the job description, and we said, these two documents don't match, which was really interesting to us, because when talking about that, they had a sense of what they wanted the youth ministry to look like. But when building the job description, which is essentially what you're supposed to do or the expectations, they weren't even close to the same. And so we started a process with them of sort of digging in and asking those questions of what do you want this to look like? And how is family ministry and youth ministry shaping your church? And how does it involve in your church, not just in this little corner? Because it's really important to make sure that everybody measure things the same way. Another example that we have is, and we're going to get into this in defining things in a minute. We had a church that we were working with where they would often say, and everybody's heard this, we've all said it. The things that we used to do before were working really well, so we should try some of those things again, right? There's all been a game, there's been a time, there's been a moment in our church or our ministry's history where things were really humming, and we're like, if we could just get back to that. And this church was saying this to us a lot. And so we put out a survey, and in the survey that about 50 of the people responded to, we said, when was the church in its heyday? And we gave 6 options, like 50s to 60s, 60s to 70s, 70s to 80s, that sort of thing. And everybody agreed that the church needed to get back to where it used to be. The interesting thing was everybody defined that during a different time period. So I've got 3 people on my list, so I'm just going to pick on people's names. So Joey could say, we really need to get back to the way it used to be. And then Jay could say, you know what, Joey's absolutely right. We do need to get back to the way it used to be. And then Michael could say, Joey and Jay are absolutely right. We do need to get back to the way it used to be. But if Joey's thinking about the 60s and Jay's thinking about the 90s and Michael's thinking about last year, then you're not actually having the same, no bell bottoms, they're not actually having the same conversation. And so you don't know how to judge whether or not something is working. And so in youth ministry, that's a little bit tough, because if your church is having trouble doing that, then that's going to sort of muddy up the way that they view your ministry working. You could look at your ministry as doing something really well and working the way that you're intending it to, but others from the outside could look and say, well, maybe it's not working so well. And so what our job is in youth ministry in that moment, first is to, maybe take a look at our church and say, is this a problem that our church is actually having? Does our church have metrics or that maybe that's not a word we should use, but do they have metrics to define success? And all I mean by that is, do they have a set of things that say, these are our goals and this is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is how we know whether or not it's working? And that's all. And that's important because we want to know what we're doing is working. We all feel that way. And if your church doesn't have a set of those, then at the very least, you need to be able to develop those in your own ministry and then be able to articulate them to other people. So that when people come to you and say, well, we should really try this or we should really try that, you have the ability to go, and we're going to sort of end on this idea too. This is how we're measuring what's happening right now. This is how we've set it up. And so based on what we're doing and how we're measuring it, this is what's working. This is extremely helpful when you're talking to elders, when you're talking to senior leaders, when you're in a job review and somebody goes, well, maybe you didn't, we wanted you to grow, but you didn't really grow. And you could say, well, maybe we're not defining those things quite the same way. So I'm going to define success here. And so we know what it looks like. Now, doing this in conjunction, of course, with your senior team is important. But if other people aren't intentionally doing this, then it would probably be beneficial to you if you just did it on your own to make sure that at the very least you're measuring what's going on. And it might be worth taking a minute to look and say, is my church as a whole struggling with this? Because if they are, then you're going to be starting from a different place when you start measuring that. And you're going to be aware of when those conversations start to get a little bit squirrely and how to sort of maybe bring them back to where you want them to go. So, the first thing that I've noticed a lot that I want to make sure we say is a lot of churches are struggling how to measure success. This is really going to be the case coming out of the pandemic a lot. People are going to be using pre-pandemic natural metrics to judge post-pandemic success. And that, if that's done, it's not going to work. And if that's done unintentionally or intentionally, it's going to be very difficult for everybody in every ministry area. And so we really want to try to start bringing that conversation up with our senior leaders, or at the very least with our youth team, sort of as we move forward. So that's the first thing. Here's the second thing, and it sort of goes along. They all sort of go together. There's a theme today. The first one is make sure you're defining terms during important conversations. Always take the time to make sure you define what you're talking about while you're talking about it, because it's pretty safe to assume that most people aren't talking about things in the same way that you are. So I used the example of that church with the survey already. Here's the big one. Here's the term that everybody uses, that every church coach, consultant, every one of me, every one of whoever's, every course that is pitched to you, here's the word that's used: growth. Don't you want your youth group to grow? Don't you want your church to grow? And the question that we always need to be asking and defining is, what does growth actually mean? Are we talking about numerical growth? Are we talking about kids that already are Christians? Are we talking about people that don't know Jesus yet? Are we talking about financial growth? Do we want our budget to go up? Do we want the church to make more money by bringing in more families? Does the budget even matter? Are we talking about spiritual growth? I would imagine there are a lot of pastors on this. And the trick question that I always like to ask is, Joey, I won't ask you, Joey, but you're just in front of me. How do you measure spiritual growth, right? How do you put that into a metric to say it's very difficult. There are markers and there's ways along the way, but that's actually hard. And so measuring growth is really important, but defining it is almost even more important, because I was talking to a pastor a few weeks ago, and he told me this story where one of the elders came to him and said, our church hasn't really grown that much. And the pastor was a little confused, because the church in the 18 months prior had gone from about 60 people on a Sunday morning service average to 90 people, which is, 50% growth in 18 months. Most of our ministries would take that. And so he went, well, what are you talking about? We've done a pretty good job of growing. And the elder went, yes, but we haven't grown in this area. And what he meant was the growth area was one particular demographic, but the area that he would have liked to have seen growth was in a different demographic. And so you've got an elder and a pastor that are both probably in conversations talking about growth all the time, actually having a completely different conversation about what it means. And, we know this in youth ministry all the time. Everybody always comes up to youth ministry people and says, we'd love to see more kids. And what I'd really challenge you to dig into, if you're not already, is what does that mean both to you and to them? More, we had a youth ministry that I was a part of once where we grew from 12 to 20 in about a year, which was fine. But all the kids that came were kids that didn't know Jesus. So then we were, as a leadership team, at a numerical growth capacity, but we needed to start investing more time into spiritual growth for the kids that had showed up that now needed the time. But what others people on the outside would say is, well, you grew for a while, but then you stopped. So how can we help? And I would go, no. We're still growing. We're just not growing in that way anymore. It's not defined the same way. I do a workshop called Children Aren't the Future of the Church, which triggers everybody, and it makes me so happy. And what we do in that workshop is we spend the first hour of the workshop defining children, defining future, and defining church. Because if I get a room of 20 people, I know that I'm going to get 12 definitions of what children are. And I know that almost everybody in the room is going to have a different view of what the future means. Is it now? Is it in 10 years? Is it when I'm gone? Is it when I'm tired? Is it when I'm dead? Right? All of these things come up. But when you're not having the same conversation, when you have 6 people go, well, children are the future, what actually happens is they just kind of get kicked down the road and kicked down the road and kicked down the road because you never clearly define those things. Contemporary versus traditional is sometimes something you need to define. Contemporary technically is like anything that's happened in the last 18 months. So if you're at a church that says they are having contemporary worship, but they're singing Shine, Jesus, Shine, maybe they're not as contemporary as they think or as they're attempting to advertise themselves to be. And again, that's okay as long as everybody actually knows what you're talking about. So what I would say is make sure you take a few minutes and define things that you talk about as you go along, even like really super simply in regular conversations, because you'd be shocked by the amount of people that you think you're having the same conversation with, that you're having a completely different conversation with. It surprises me every time that I do it, and I go in expecting it to happen. And so this is one of the areas that I probably didn't do a great job of throughout my entire youth ministry career. But looking back, if I had, I think it probably would have taken down some barriers and helped me out quite a bit. Okay, so those are the first two. Know kind of how to measure success. I will have you know, Shine, Jesus. I didn't say Shine, Jesus, Shine wasn't a banger. I just said it wasn't contemporary, at least not by the dictionary definition of the term. So I pick it out because I love it and it's endearing to me, but it's, you know, to me, I sit there and I go, well, we need contemporary music. I need mid-2000s Hillsong United, right? Give me 6 electric guitars all at the same time. That's what I'm looking for. That's not what contemporary music is today. It's all just, this is why talking about that is so important. So the first one, define success. The second one, make sure you define the things you're talking about. You can see a theme. Here's the third one, and maybe we forget this one sometimes. People only know about what we're talking about. So, you know, make sure that if you want somebody to know about something, you direct a conversation this way. So this is how it happens most often, especially in a church. Somebody will come and say, hey, I really heard that dodgeball event you had last night was awesome. Or I heard that scavenger hunt you did was great. And it's really easy to get sucked in, especially as people who love running events and we love to be creative. And when we come up with some new event or we combine 3 games into one super game and nobody actually gets hurt, we can't wait to tell everybody we know about it. And I think we all know that about ourselves. The problem is when we just talk about that event, then people in the church just think we're doing events or people in the church only see those things. Right. So the amount of times that people have gone, yeah, it looked like you had a great time. And you have a 10-minute conversation about this event. You don't talk about Bible studies. You don't talk about prayer. You don't talk about small groups. You talk about future planning. And you're almost pigeonholing yourself into what you're doing, even though you know and I know that youth ministry is about a lot more than that. Not everybody in your congregation knows that, right? The last youth leader that I recruited, we were having a conversation and I said to her, you would be an amazing youth leader. I would really like you to be a part of the team. And she said, I don't really know. I don't know if that would be a good fit. And I said, you'd be terrific. And she goes, well, I don't want to teach. I don't want to teach. And I said, you don't have to teach. I got a big mouth. I like to teach. I'm happy to teach. No problem. And she goes, okay, all right. Well, she goes, well, I don't want to run the games. I don't like to run the games. I don't want to run. I'm not creative. And I said, I don't need you to run the games. I stay on the sideline. Don't even play the games. That's fine. Don't worry about it. And she goes, okay. She goes, well, I can't do music. And I said, that's great. I got a bunch of teenagers over there. There's a drum kit. They're going to play the music. That's going to be fine. And she goes, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, I just want you to get to know the kids. Here's a group of kids. I just want you to get to know them, be their friend, support them, be their small group leader. And it occurred to me after that, although this conversation sort of happened naturally and not intentionally, that was all this person had ever seen of youth group. All they had seen was games. All they had seen was talking in the front. All they had seen was the youth worship band on a Sunday morning. So it wasn't even that they weren't well equipped, it's that they actually didn't know enough about the ministry. And in youth ministry, we take that for granted a ton, because if you've been in youth ministry 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, we know this stuff front and back and front. We know what it looks like. We know what volunteers are. We know what small groups look like. We know all this stuff, but we need to remember that probably the majority of the people in our church don't actually understand it the way that we do. And so if we want them to know about something that's happening, it's up to us to direct that conversation towards that topic. Hey, I saw that you guys had a lot of fun. We did. We played dodgeball for about 15 minutes, but then we spent 15 minutes in a short teaching time, and our kids spent 45 minutes in small groups. Oh, wow. What do they do in small groups? Well, they've got a couple of small group leaders, and they share prayer requests, and they talk about their week, and blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden, this person that didn't really know anything about your ministry other than that short little snippet that they saw, all of a sudden has a much deeper look at what your ministry is. And that's just us as youth leaders intentionally steering the conversation in that direction. Remembering that they're not going to define youth ministry the same way that you or I are going to define it. And because they're not in it, they don't know how to judge success or whether it's working or not. So to them, from the outside, success is kids running around and nobody bleeding, which even for some of us might be different. I don't know. But all that to say, right? If we can help people get to where we are in thinking about it, the amount of support that we start to get on the back end really starts to grow. Because of course, the more people understand things and the more people get excited about them, the more they want to push you and get behind you. Okay. And here's the fourth one. We deal with this all the time. I think probably in our ministries, we deal with comparison and we deal with competition. Sometimes, I don't know if you've ever felt this way as a youth leader or youth pastor. I have sometimes maybe in moments felt like the inferior ministry leader. Like there's an org chart and there's like 3 people and then there's a ham sandwich and then I'm down here somewhere. And that kind of happens sometimes, and we can kind of get our backs up. And even though we know what we're doing is important, people can compare our ministries to other ministries, other youth ministries, all that kind of things. And here's what I just say with this. If you're running into this, if you're running into comparison, 2 things. One, which we all know, understand the context of your ministry versus the context of whatever you're being compared to, right? Our ministry got compared to another youth ministry a few years ago when I was working at a church. And somebody came up to me completely kind-hearted and said, hey, I've seen this church really doing this stuff. Have you ever thought about doing that? And I thought, yeah, that's a really good idea. And in the moment you think, yeah, why aren't I doing that, right? And then you go look at that church and you realize they have a full-time youth pastor and 2 part-time youth interns and a family ministry pastor that oversees them. And you go, oh, that's why, because I'm working 40 hours a week and they're working 200 hours a week. They have a little bit more time to do some of the things that we're doing. And so that's one thing. Make sure you understand the context. And the second is this. And this is the dead horse that I continue to beat in any group that I'm in ever. It's know your mission, know your purpose, know what you're there to do, right? Know the difference, and I'm going to go through this really fast, between a mission, a vision, and a method, because understanding clearly the difference between those 3 things is so important, right? Your mission is your purpose. That's your why. That's why you're doing what you're doing. That's why your church or your ministry, depending on how you're tiering it down, exists, right? If you know that first, then the rest comes pretty easy, right? Because if you know your mission, which is your why, then your vision is just how you get there, right? It's the roadmap, it's the steps you take. If your mission is your why, then your vision is your how, right? And visions change over time, they shift. For example, if I'm going to go to the grocery store, my mission is I need food. The vision is I need to get it I need to get from here to there to get it. But once I'm at the grocery store, I've made it. The GPS has said you've arrived. And once I've arrived, I can change that and do something else, right? It's vision kind of goes with goals. You set a goal, you figure out how you're going to achieve it, and then you get there, right? And this is the third thing, and it's methods. And we always do this backwards. So many churches do this backwards. They go method first, they go vision second, and then they go mission third. And they do it backwards. And then what happens is you get into a competition or a conversation about whose idea is best, right? I have an idea of how this retreat should run. And Joey has an idea of how this retreat should run. And Jay has an idea, and Alan has an idea, and Michael has an idea. And all of a sudden it's like this idea versus that idea. But if we can start that conversation with, well, what's accomplishing the mission best? Then it's actually not me versus you versus you versus you ever. It's us versus the mission. It all of a sudden puts us on the same team. It gets us pulling in the same direction. And I say it like this, you can't, and I go like this, and on a screen, it looks like I'm going to punch you, but I promise I'm not. And even if I do, it's probably not going to make it. You can't hold your mission and your methods tightly at the same time. You cannot do it, right? If you hold tightly to your mission, then your methods are always going to change, because you're going to be able to gauge whether or not it's working, and you're going to be willing to change, because you're going to say, we don't really care what we're doing as long as what we're doing is working, as long as we're accomplishing the mission. But if you go like this, if you say, we need to do youth ministry this way, then your mission hand is open. It has to be, because you're keying in on only certain things that you can do. And so some of us get stuck in this idea of this is how we do it, as opposed to this is why we do it. And that's why that fourth one is so important. When you get comparison, when you get people coming in with ideas that maybe you don't want to do or you don't like, when you have that one person in the church that has a lot of influence that comes in and says, you should really do this, right? But you don't really want to. You don't want it to be my idea versus your idea. What you want it to do is transition that conversation and say, thanks so much for that amazing idea. Here's the mission of our youth ministry. How does what you're talking about fit into that? And ask it honestly and genuinely. How is the idea that you have, which is such a cool idea, it doesn't even sound like anybody's going to bleed. How does that idea make it into the mission of our youth ministry? And if it doesn't make it, they're going to see that right away. And they're going to go, you know, that was a cool idea, but maybe it just doesn't sound like it fits what you're doing right now. And you're going to be able to say, yeah, but you know what, keep throwing ideas at me, because now that you know what our mission is, I bet you'll come up with something great, right? So mission is the why, vision is the how, method is the what, right? So this is kind of what this looks like from a church level, not from a youth ministry level, but from a big church level. The mission of the church is probably to spread the love of Jesus to your community. That could be one of your missions or one of your cores. The vision of that would be, how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to reach teens in the community that you don't know, right? So our mission is to reach people with Jesus. The vision is we're going to reach teens that we don't know. And then the method is we're going to run a drop-in center or whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter what it is. But if you start with the method, then you never actually get to the other side. And this helps you in every conversation you're going to have ever. It's going to help you with your team, because you're going to set a course with your team, right? Joey's doing this thing in a couple of weeks when you're going to plan out your whole calendar, right? You're going to learn how to plan your calendar and you're going to plan it out. And at some point during the year, a couple of your youth ministry leaders are going to get itchy, and they're going to go, well, we know the calendar says this, but should we really do this? Should we really do that? And what you want to be able to say is, actually what we've got planned is totally on mission for us. And we've got a way that we're gauging whether or not it works. And we're going to give it a little bit of time to breathe to see whether or not that's going to happen. And that's the greatest way to sort of overcome dealing with comparison and dealing with competition. So that's about my time. It's 12:40, which is, I think, about when you wanted me to talk until. I love talking about this stuff. This is so much fun for me, because it's breaking through those barriers in youth ministry or in any ministry that we don't always see. It's the stuff that's just under the surface. Simple things like defining things the same way opens up so many different doors and maybe closes doors that you don't want to go through anyways. And so this is why I just love having these conversations with churches. And this is sort of at Church Helper what we do when we say we are trying to help churches make every decision on purpose. This is how we do it. We say, okay, if we're going to make a purposeful decision, let's know exactly what we're talking about. Let's know exactly what we're trying to do. Let's know exactly why we're trying to do it, right? And even though every church's mission statement is probably some combination of the Great Commission and the Greatest Commandment, it's still nice to be able to talk about that and remind people of it and remind them that, the mission is not to make sure the parlor room stays clean or whatever ends up becoming the mission every once in a while, right? So that's sort of what I've got now. Joey, I don't know if you've got any questions